then last thing we need to look at, which is the way the cerebral cortex handles noxious stimuli leading to the perception of pain. I need to remind you of this slide. So in red at the fingertip and then on through the central nervous system is the pathway taken by nociceptors and the cells on which the nociceptors terminate, and then the thalamus and then cortex. So remember, if we follow these red lines up here in cortex, we see that some of them end in the postcentral gyrus. That's where the first somatic sensory cortex is. Some of them end in the cingulate gyrus, the cortex that's just above the corpus callosum. I'm going to point out a place called the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex as being the key component of cingulate gyrus. And some of it ends in what's called the insula. So we're going to look at two parts of the insula. One part that's very close to S2. Remember, S1 talks to S2. So that's called the posterior insula. And then another part, which is called anterior insula. And I'm going to show you, we'll talk a little bit about the data, that the anterior insula and the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex are elemental, fundamental to the perception of agonizing pain, perception of punishing pain. So the kind of pain that is designed, that works, not designed, but works to keep you from doing stupid things more than once. So, remind you of this, separate cortical areas, S1 gets input indirectly through several synapses dealing with nociception, and so does cingulate gyrus, dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, and the anterior insula. So let's see that next slide, and we'll accent on that. Now we're looking at the cerebral cortex from the midline. So this would be the right hemisphere. The eyes would be sitting here, and they'd be looking out in this way. There's the cerebellum back here. And here from the lateral surface, so now this is the left hemisphere, and you're able to see these guys. And the reason they've done it this way is so that now you can see the first somatic sensory cortex, S1, and S2. And then if you dig into the cortex a bit, you see the posterior insula here, and the anterior insula there. On the medial surface, you see the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex. There's a corpus callosum right here. And like I said, the cingulate gyrus sits just above the corpus callosum. We're worried about that little chunk of it right there. You'll notice the anterior insula, the ant-ins, and the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex are in red. Whereas S1, S2, and a related region called the posterior insula are in green. That's because we know these areas respond to different aspects of a noxious stimulus. Now, picture the following. You're walking along late at night in your house. You have a sibling, younger, tends to be pretty cavalier about things. Okay, so leaves a really sharp object on the floor. You're barefoot. You step on it. Almost immediately, you know you've done something wrong. There's a sharp pain, and you know exactly where it occurred, not on your arm, not on your hand, but on your foot. So it is discriminative. That is, you can discriminate between a puncture wound in your foot and a heat wound. If you're stepping on something particularly hot, you know the difference, right? Or you know the difference between a puncture wound in your hand and a puncture wound on your arm. So you can tell where something has happened, and you can tell what has happened, right? But there's also this other part of pain whenever you cause any sort of tissue damage, and it is punishing pain, agonizing pain, burning pain. So it's designed, or it works, to keep you from doing that again. One would hope that with time, either you or your nefarious sibling would learn to change behaviors. Best you do it first. So start wearing shoes around the house. punishing pain. And those two are very different, right? Punishing pain is very hard to localize in the sense that you feel the same sort of agonizing pain no matter what's caused it or where it's been caused. Well, I'm going to tell you that the regions in green, S1, S2, and the posterior insula are all involved in the discriminative aspects of pain. If you change the metrics of a noxious stimulus, if you increase the heat or you add more energy to a pressure put on the skin, S1, S2, and posterior insula will all change their response. We're looking at fMRI, so they all change their bold signal. Right? They all do. But if you put in a stimulus and you ask someone to tell you how much it hurts, S1, S2, and the posterior insula, they're not strictly tied to that. You can put in the same heat twice, and maybe the second time it hurts more. S1, S2, and the posterior insula, their response doesn't change. What does change as the intensity of the pain changes, the agonizing component of pain, is the dorsal anterior cingulate and the anterior insula. That's true. So we think of them as their activity as being essential for punishing pain. Okay, great. You can do experiments where you can put in all sorts of distractors so that someone doesn't feel it nearly so painful a second time you apply a stimulus. They'll report, it didn't hurt so much, maybe a 4 out of 10, and you'll see the dorsal anterior cingulate and the anterior insula, their activity, their bold signal decrease. Whereas if you do something that's annoying and now the pain gets greater, people report 7 instead of a 5 in the pain scale. The anterior insula, the dorsal anterior cingulate, their activity goes up. Their bold signal increases. Right? So you got that. A word about the insula. It means island. If you look, you see it buried in the lateral fissure. Okay, fine. In general, I'm going to tell you the insula can be thought of as interoceptive. Basically a chunk of brain that's designed to answer the question, how you doing? How you feeling? If things are great, you're full, you've had some food, you're pretty happy, you got a lot of sleep last night, you're not too isolated, so you've seen some friends, the insula says you're great, things are great. But, if you didn't sleep well, staying at home is annoying, the insula says not so good. Not feeling all that great. And here we have the anterior insula, which reports really strongly how you doing by saying, that hurt, and I'm annoyed because that really hurt. Right? So that's what we've got. We have what's called the cortical axis of pain. S1, S2, posterior insula, the discriminative aspects of pain, anterior insula, dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, the punishing aspects of pain.